Islam is a tradition of praxis rather than belief. That surrendering at the root of Islam doesn't require a certain kind of belief, but it does require a certain kind of action. But that doesn't mean that belief or faith is totally lacking in Islam or not valued in Islam. To be an actual believer, to believe in the principles of Islam, and there are 5 different ideas that a Muslim should believe in, is known as a mu'min. So one can be a Muslim without being a mu'min. You can't be a mu'min without being a Muslim. So the 5 ideas are these. First is the principle of Tawhid, and that is probably the most important principle in Islam. And that's the principle of the unity of God, right? That God is actually one. To some extent, that's manifested in the Shahada. And the Shahada, it can be seen as a kind of equivalent to the Jewish Shema. The Shahada is there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. Tawhid, or the idea of the unity of God, is also the principle from which generates some of the theological tension with Christianity. So it's within this idea of the unity of God that we understand, or that Muslims traditionally say, that you can't represent God. For example, anthropomorphize God in images. So Islamic art traditionally, although this is not true across the board, certainly doesn't represent God, but also doesn't represent human images, or sometimes even animal images. The representations of Jesus, for example, and other divine representations in many Christian forms, is seen minimally by Muslims as peculiar, but often as really a direct contradiction to this idea that God is not just unified, but also above human understanding, that you simply can't represent God. So Tawhid is this idea of the unity of God, and that's the first Muslim idea. But the second is that of the belief in angels. In a sense, that's kind of implied in that second part of the Shahada, and Muhammad is his messenger, right? But Muhammad, of course, gets his revelations through the angel Gabriel. So the angels are inferior to Allah, right? They exist. There are several of them. They are made of a kind of light, often seen in the tradition, and they're important as messengers of Allah, from Allah. But below the angels are another kind of being that I think can be encompassed in this belief system, and that's jinn, right? They come from the genie. Genies these jinn are these sorts of kind of troublemaking angels, or angel-type beings that work havoc in the world. Jinn are an interesting kind of phenomenon for thinking about how evil comes into the world, and mischief and other problems, and even human misbehavior. It comes through the behavior of this external force. The external force is invisible. It's part, in a sense, of the divine world, but it's also not directly controlled in the same way by Allah. The third principle are prophets and scripture. So it's believing, certainly in the Quran, and the prophets that are mentioned in the Quran as being authentic prophets. Again, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, they have no place in Islamic thought, although some of the prophets who are mentioned in those sources and the ideas in those sources do show up, sometimes in the same context, most frequently in different contexts, in the Quran. But belief in them and their authenticity is a critical part of this principle. Another principle is the final judgment. This also deals with God's unity and justice, and is simply the idea that at the end of days, right, there will be a final judgment of human beings on earth, and that God's justice, and the sense of justice, will be brought into accord with what we actually see. That will be followed by the last judgment. So there's an idea that bodies will come up again. There will be a bodily resurrection at the end of days with the coming back of Jesus. And at that point, everybody will be judged again for their actions, and the scores will be settled. The just will get rewarded, and those who are evil will ultimately get punished. And the last principle is that of the divine decree and predestination. It's the idea that God already knows and predetermines what will happen, be it on a larger level, that is a communal level, or on an individual level. Nevertheless, right, God has a certain kind of compassion, and humans have free will. That's a tension. We find it as a tension in Jewish thought and Christian thought as well, as how you reconcile kind of human free will, which is absolutely necessary for any kind of conception of justice, and that God can actually punish or reward people for their choices, with the sense that God knows everything in all time from the beginning. These principles are very broad, and there's a great amount of diversity within each idea, and different Muslims and Muslim thinkers certainly will express these ideas in different ways.